Hey, Tim Frisch with the Frisch Perspective here. Today I'd like to talk to you about a topic that I know can be confusing, but it's also a topic that I think is really important, and it's something that I think a lot of Christians want to learn about and need to learn about. It's the topic of Bible translation. I've talked about this before, but today I specifically want to recommend to you one particular translation and talk to you about why I love it so much. And that translation is the New King James Version. So as you can tell when I say New King James, that this version of the Bible is actually an update of what was called the King James Version. And some of you already know the history, but the King James Bible is a translation of the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek Bible text into English, and it was completed in 1611 and commissioned by King James in England. And so it became known as the King James Version. It is a very widely used version in English-speaking countries and has been used now for over 400 years. So the King James itself is a wonderful translation with a lot of history behind it and is a big part, especially of the Protestant heritage of Christianity. And so for those of you who are Christians in the United States of America, you probably have heard of the King James Version, and many people out there have read it. Now, this translation, the King James, has had a lot of influence, but it uses words that today are very dated. And so obviously when you're reading the King James, you get words like thee and thou, and those kinds of Elizabethan language that we just don't use today. So the New King James is an update of that original King James Version. And what I love about it is it continues the tradition of the King James Version. I really think when you're choosing a translation, you can use different ones, and there's some great ones out there like the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the New International Version, the Christian Standard Bible. They have a little bit of different philosophies behind them, but they're all very good translations. However, they're all kind of a lot more modern in their approach, whereas the New King James Version is really a tie-in with the King James Version itself. It sounds a lot like the King James Version. So for me, the King James has a special place in my life and heart because I grew up with it, and I memorized so many verses growing up as a child in the King James Version. And I know there's a lot of people out there who've had the same experience. The King James Version has also been used for centuries, for over 400 years. So it has a great heritage behind it and is a big part of Christianity in the Western English-speaking world. I'll tell you too, a lot of Christians love the King James Version because they have this desire to be tied into the past. And so the New King James Version really carries on that tradition of saying, okay, here was a great Protestant era translation of the Bible, and we can still utilize that, but in a way that's more understandable and accurate and accessible for today. So the New King James really ties into the King James, and that's why it's called the New King James, and it has a lot of continuity. It has the wording, a lot of the word structure they continue to use. However, they updated the language on it, which I'll talk more about. But even things like, if you are familiar with the King James Version, they try to be very accurate to the original words. And if they added words in the English to help clarify something or to make it sound better in English, they would use these italicized type words so that you knew, okay, they were adding these words to the original words that were in the original language. So the New King James Version continues to use those italicized words in the translation. The other thing I really like about it is the King James Version itself, again, was used for over 400 years. It was updated several times, most recently in 1769. That was the last major update of the King James. So the New King James was completed in 1982. and is considered the next update in that line of updates that was previously done. But the King James remained essentially the same for hundreds of years, and the New King James is similar to that. It is not a fad translation. It's not always changing, and so it really ties in with the King James tradition, but it also is a translation that doesn't change all the time. They're not updating it. They have never updated it since 1982, and personally I really like that. I also like the fact that when it comes to some of the other translations, I think that they are there's some of them are trying to be tied in with the King James. So for example, the English Standard Version in some ways tries to retain the wording of the King James, but at the same time they've changed so much that it really doesn't read like the King James. Whereas the New King James really is a child of the King James itself. And you see a lot of resemblance to the King James when you read it. And so it really retains the beauty and the wording of the King James Version. But it has been updated because the original King James Version was updated at times, but the last time they did that was in the 1700s. So now a couple hundred years later, the words had become very dated, and the translation, in order to be accurate and understandable in English, really needed a major update. And so that's what the New King James translators were seeking to do: update the King James Version for today. So let me talk a little bit about how they produced it. It's a fascinating story, and the thing that is so wonderful about the New King James Version is that they didn't just take the King James Bible and say, okay, you know what we'll do? We'll just take the words, we'll update them here and there, and then we'll sell it and try to make a lot of money. That's not what they were doing. They had a group of 130 scholars who were all committed to the inerrancy of Scripture, and they spent 7 years on this project, which I believe is how long it took to produce the King James Version. The King James Version, just a bit of history here, was actually largely based, I believe, on the Bishop's Bible from the 1500s. And so the King James translators were actually using existing translations and seeking to make the best translation based on what had already been done. The New King James translators were doing the same thing with the King James itself. They're trying to make the best translation based on the King James itself. So they sought to achieve three things, which were accuracy, beauty, and completeness. And as I said, it was 130 scholars. They started in 1975, and they finished the project in 1982. So the translation went for beauty, and one of the things that's great about it is it really retains the beauty of the King James. But it also seeks to be updated in, for example, its textual scholarship. Now, what they chose to do here is really interesting. They didn't say, well, we're going to take all the scholarship that's been done since the King James translation time, and we're just going to totally, use a different textual basis. For those of you who are familiar with Bibles, the New King James Version actually does use the Textus Receptus, which is what the King James writers were using, and they kept that in the body of the text. What they added for accuracy and for completeness were textual notes. And so in other Bibles, you'll actually read, the best manuscripts say this, and they'll put that in a note, or they'll put certain verses in brackets, or in some cases, you won't see verses in the text that were traditionally there. The New King James really has the same text that you see in the King James. It's still based on the Textus Receptus, but it does have all these notes underneath. And what I love about their notes is they don't say anything like the best manuscripts or the most reliable manuscripts. They just tell you that these are the manuscripts that say this over here, and this manuscript says something over here. So they leave it to the reader and to the researcher to kind of decide what kind of judgment call they would make as to what the text would say. So I think that's really great. And so in saying all of this, they retained a lot of beauty, but also updated the accuracy of it for today. And I think the King James translators would actually be very approving of the New King James itself. One of the things, though, that they did for accuracy is they really went for a translation philosophy that is, I think, really good. And it's called complete equivalence. And so this is supposed to be a little bit of a play on, if you're familiar with translation philosophy, you have formal equivalence. If you get too extreme with formal equivalence, the idea there is you're taking the original language and you're trying to get it from that language to our language, English. But the problem, as many of you know, is that the original language may not convert directly into our language very well. If you've ever used like Google Translate or some sort of a computerized translator like that, you've probably seen that happen, where if you just try to take the words directly from one language and put them to the other, it's not actually always very accurate, or it definitely doesn't read the way that we would read things and say things. So that formal equivalence can be too rigid, and it can actually be less accurate. But mainly it can just be a problem of just not reading very well. It's like you're trying to read and it just doesn't sound right. So on the other side would be pushing more toward paraphrasing, saying, okay, well, we don't want to be so rigid about how we translate, so we're gonna be looser with our translation. The problem there is that when you use that approach to translating, you can start to say, well, I think what they meant by that was, and then you start actually translating some of your own viewpoints into the actual text. And so that can be a problem. So what they were trying to do with the New King James Version, and I love this approach, is to be as close to the original as possible, but still have flexibility there in how things are worded, both for accuracy and beauty. And that's exactly the kind of approach the original King James translators took. The King James Bible is not actually a super rigid translation. They were willing to take the original text and try to make them sound a way that would be pleasant, in a way that would hit home to English readers. And so the New King James took that same approach. Also, they really sought to take the words from the King James Version, and in order to be accurate, they had to modernize some of those words. Because the truth is, words that you used in 1611 may have been accurate at the time when they translated, but they may not be accurate today. So a good example of this is the word matrix. When the King James translators used the word matrix, they were referring to the womb of an animal, not some sort of a 1990s sci-fi movie. But if you use the word matrix today, it has a different meaning. And words do that. You know, another example in our usage of words is the word gay, which, you know, not too long ago meant happy. When people used it, they were just talking about being happy and they were gay. Now it has a different connotation. And so from the time of the 1600s to today, some of these words in the King James have changed meaning. And so in order to be accurate, they had to update those kinds of words.